Hey guys, welcome to Therapy with B, beyond the sessions or behind the sessions. I've not yet decided what it's going to be, but I thought I would make content around what it's like to be a therapist. Who am I? What am I doing? When I first started making content, I thought to myself, maybe I shouldn't talk about myself because as a therapist, I don't speak about myself. And that's kind of the point. Like, my clients don't come to me to hear my life story, and I don't really like hearing my life story. Like, I'm not the type of person who needs to be center stage. Equally, sometimes there's a time and place, and so I thought this can be our time and place. So I got my handy dandy laptop, I got my water, very Aussie accent for me, and I thought, let's speak a bit about life, me, some of the anecdotes I have from my own story, or some of the things I've been through, or maybe we will have people on where we can discuss some real life examples of what you might be going through. Because when I'm sat in a session, of course, I'm wanting to be a bit of a mirror for my client or to facilitate a space of self reflection. But outside of that, that's not what I'm doing in my interpersonal relationships. That's the difference between my personal relationships. And so this is kind of going to be a combination of two. The other thought I had when I was first starting content is, what path do I do? Do I become really serious? And I always thought, gosh, what if I make therapy content and then that becomes my only thing? And I really didn't want to be put in that box. I like doing my day job and then being able to live life. And so I thought, rather than trying to follow the paths of other people I've seen online, I'll just make my own. And so this is part of that. I thought, let's maybe start with who I am. I don't know if people want to know that. I'm a therapist, which is, I think, perhaps one of the least interesting things about me, but to many other people, it's the most interesting thing about me. I now will tell people I have a different job if I'm on a plane, because usually, if you tell someone you're a therapist, they start to trauma dump. A trauma dump is not when you are in a friendly relationship with someone and you're telling them about your life. I always hear people say this to me in sessions when they say, I don't want to trauma dump with you. I don't want to trauma dump with my friends. But actually, if we have a relationship, I want to hear what's going on in your life. I want to hear the drama. I want to hear what is stressing you out. I want to hear what you're going through. I want to hear about your relationship with your family or your partner because I'm your friend and I care about you. Now, if you're a stranger on a British Airways flight and you ask me my job and then you start telling me about your four kids, not that this happened in real life, then I don't really, it's not that I don't care, but it's rather that I would rather be watching my movies and sleeping on the plane. And so I'm a therapist. I'm also a friend, a sister. I am funny. I'm someone who loves life and is always trying to be as present as I can. But that's not necessarily where it started. When I was younger, well, let's go way back to when I was a kid, I was painfully shy. Like, genuinely, it was ridiculous. It got to the point where every year, parents' evening, the teachers would say the exact same thing. Like, I wish I brought the copies of like the written notes from parents' evening because every year it would be the same thing. She has her friends, but like she doesn't really like put her hand up in class. She doesn't really mingle too much. Like, she's really silent. And I thought that was a good thing because I was still getting my work done, still doing my homework. I had my handful of people, but to my teachers, this was like a real problem. And now as an adult, I can see why it was a problem. Like, children who feel safe are actually quite loud. They're actually kind of a bit chaotic. They can play, they can have fun because you only play where you feel safe. You can only express yourself where you feel safe. When you don't feel safe emotionally, you cannot express yourself because you just can't. Your body is in self-preservation. And to be honest, for me, my shyness stemmed from self-preservation as opposed to my personality trait, even though I thought it was a personality trait. I guess it was partially a self-fulfilling prophecy because others had told me I was really quiet, and so I became more and more and more quiet. But equally, I think it came from the fact that I was just in survival mode. And so I did not want to rock the boat. I wanted to be a good child or a good enough child. And to me, that was synonymous with just being silent. And so that's what I did. The thing is when you are shy, and it stems from that place that I said, not necessarily your personality. And I'm also, I should clarify, not saying that introverts are this sort of personality, because it's totally fine to want to have alone time. It's totally fine to want to be by yourself and spend time by yourself. But when it's the extreme where you label yourself as shy or antisocial or awkward, that's a word I used to use a lot when I was a teenager. I always used to say, I'm just really awkward. And it wasn't until I had a conversation with someone who said, no, you're not. You're like a bit goofy, yeah, but like you're not awkward. There was something in that conversation that completely flipped how I viewed myself. Now, as a therapist, if I'm to zoom out and put my therapist hat back on, what I realized is they normalized my self-expression. Like, I had critiqued it and I had put myself in this box that I felt like I could not come out of because others had put me in that box, because that box felt really comfortable. And our brain goes towards what's comfortable, even if it is limiting, even if it's self-destructive, even if it's completely selling ourselves short and it stems from a place of self-hatred or a lack of self-love. Our brain will go towards the comfort. But what we find, whether it's in our healthy relationships that we make throughout our life, or whether it's in our relationships with our therapist, is when someone can mirror to you that what you're experiencing is actually really normal because you are human and you're a person, that can be healing. And that's what happened for me in that moment. When they told me that I wasn't actually as awkward as I thought I was just a bit quirky. That's what I lent into. I went from being really uncomfortable and being really silent because I didn't want to take up space and I had this fear of being seen, to taking up space. And there was something in that I was thinking about the other day, and I thought, you know what? Perfection is paralysis. I was shy because I didn't think I was good enough. That's really what it stems from, if I'm being completely frank. I was shy because I didn't feel like I was good enough and I was in self preservation mode. My nervous system was completely dysregulated and I had no way of regulating it. I didn't really know how and where to begin. And so I stayed silent. I was on mute. But once it was normalized to me that I was human, and humanity means that we are not perfect, we make mistakes, I realized that I could take up space. The other thing I started to do, which I don't know if people realize this, and I notice this with some of my clients sometimes, and this isn't me using this as an opportunity to gossip about clients, but this is me using this as an opportunity to simply reflect a pattern that keeps coming up. Because one of the things I always think as a therapist is if something keeps coming up in my sessions across many clients, there are probably other people who are experiencing this. And so that is why I'm saying this, not to expose those I'm working with, just for the sake of clarity. But the second thing that I realized happened is I stopped apologizing. I used to have this awful habit of apologizing about everything. I'd walk into a room, I'd be like, sorry. I'd bump into someone, I'd be like, sorry. They'd bump into me, sorry, sorry. I'd always be apologizing for something, always be apologizing for taking up space, for speaking over someone accidentally, for not speaking enough, for being too quiet, for being too loud. Apology, apology, apology. And what I didn't realize at the time, and what I know now, based on my job, is when you are telling yourself that you are sorry for something, when you're in this place where you compulsively apologize for simply taking up space, what you end up doing is you are reinforcing to your brain that you are a problem or you taking up space is a problem. Why? Because we apologize when we've done something wrong. And shame makes us feel like we are wrong. And so when you are in a place of shame and you operate from a place of shame, you apologize because you have this core belief that you as a person are inherently wrong or you taking up space is inherently wrong. This can stem from a variety of different places. You know, it can stem from your relationships with your parents or your guardians, maternal, paternal figures of sorts. It can stem from teachers, or perhaps you've been shamed by friends or peers or in relationships. Regardless of the root of that shame, when you feel shame, you feel like you are a problem. When you feel like you are a problem, you try and find the solution for that problem. At times when we have problems, the thing we try and do is we try and destroy the problem. And that's the sad thing, right? Like, because if you see yourself as a problem and you then try and destroy that problem, you end up in a really negative spiral. You end up silencing yourself. And that's maybe the best case scenario is just a bit of silence. That can lead to really traumatic things. It can lead to things like self harm, really self destructive behaviors or dangerous behaviors, all because you have this root or core belief that you as a person are wrong. And so for me, how that was manifesting is the apologies, right? Like I had this core belief that I was unaware of, it was not in my consciousness, that I was a problem. And so anything I did, I apologized for. And again, it took one moment where someone called me out for it, and he so, directly and maybe harshly, because I was really young. I think I was 16. It was my first job, and it was the guy who was cleaning, the kitchens. I walked in to the kitchens in my first job, and, I walked in on him cleaning, and so I apologized because I thought, "Oh my gosh, I shouldn't be here." Um, Not that I should or shouldn't, like, I wasn't actually doing anything wrong, but I apologized. And he said, "You always do that. Why do you do that?" And I suddenly was getting ripped into by this man. I was thinking, "I don't know, I'm sorry." And so I started to apologize because he was raising his voice at me. And he said, "See, here you go again. You're apologizing." thought, oh, bloody hell, I can't win. Like, if I apologize, I've done something wrong. If I stay silent, I would leave and I would apologize because I feel like I've done something wrong. Um, but actually, after that, I left and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm now just going to stop saying sorry. Like, it put me off saying sorry. Obviously, if I've done something wrong, I'll apologize. But in all the other settings, I just thought back to my silence because that worked for me and I wasn't getting scrutinized. But what happened simultaneously or potentially as a result of me stopping saying sorry is I gave myself space to start taking up space. I gave myself permission even to start taking up space, rather than thinking to myself, "Oh, yeah, I'm sorry about this," and reinforcing to my brain that I am a problem. My brain was no longer actively reinforcing that core belief. And so I was able to operate from a different place and able to actually get to the core belief rather than the reinforcement of the core belief, if that makes sense. And so again, it was another part of my journey that led me to start showing up and taking up space. Take up space is one of those annoying phrases, right? Like it's almost like that hold space thing that we saw Ariana and Cynthia Erivo do, where they were all over each other. It's annoying therapy speak, and I hate doing that. Like as much as I have been trained and I know all the jargon, I think if you don't know how to explain something to the point where a child could understand it, you probably don't know how to explain it. And so I try to stay clear of using like typical jargon from the therapy or psychology space, and I try and make things as simplistic as possible, which I'm aware to some people might make them think, "What does she know what she's talking about? Like she could have used this big word," but the reality is a lot of us don't know those words, and so why would I use words that limit people from being able to encounter or enter into the therapeutic process? Sorry, that's a complete tangent, but I thought I'd say that to simply say that I started taking up space, and I wish I had a better phrase than taking up space. But that's all I've got right now, and so we'll stick with that. The second or third or fourth thing I was thinking, the other thing I was thinking, uh, was sometimes you've got to let people experience you. One thing that came with my shyness, and I don't know if this is a universal experience, but it's something that's come up in the therapy room as well, is there are people, and I was those people. Let me not even speak about others. Well, when I was really shy, I used to do this thing where I would say, "Oh, I'm only shy with people I'm not comfortable with, and I know the people to be comfortable with." I felt like I was able to predict who was a safe person and who wasn't. Uh, to be honest, that was partially true. I have great discernment. Why? Because I had been hyper vigilant for years. You know, anyone who's been raised in an environment where they had to be aware of how their parent might respond, they had to be aware of their emotions and the reactions that might be evoked based on what they do. Or even if they're not doing anything, at times you might have been blamed for something, even if you weren't in the space. You learn to be hyper vigilant. You learn to be hyper aware of your environment and your surroundings as a form of self protection. And so this skill I had acquired. I'd somehow used it as a way of reinforcing my shyness and excusing my shyness because I said, well, if you just were safe enough, then I wouldn't feel like I had to silence myself because you'd be safe enough, you know? Like I obviously I'm just discerning something. Like I said, though my discernment has never failed me, I will say that. Uh this was an excuse. I think there's beauty in giving people a chance to experience you and giving people a chance to have their own experience, if that makes sense. Sometimes we go into relationships and we project how others are going to respond to us. And so we might actually mold ourselves to be the most palatable version of ourselves to what we think they will want or to get a response that we would want. This falls into that people pleasing category. You know, I don't know if you've heard people say that people pleasing is selfish or manipulative. There's a lot of critique of people pleasing online, and I try to not go for that approach because I'm aware that it was something we probably did as a way of adapting and a way of surviving. Every defense mechanism has once served you, and you can't hate your way out of your defenses. You actually have to take time to truly acknowledge and honor them and almost thank them for their service, which I know sounds very woo woo. But you have to be able to say, you know what? My hypervigilance once served me, and now I can regulate myself and almost tell myself I don't need to do that anymore. And the same for people pleasing. If you grew up in an environment, God forbid, if you grew up in an environment where your parent was really abusive or violent, then people pleasing or being the peacemaker child was the best thing you could have done because it was the thing that preserved you and it was the thing that benefited you the most. So so if that's the space you grew up in, then thank goodness you were able to people please. Like how beautiful and adaptive of your brain to learn that strategy. But as you get into adulthood, you realize, oh, this doesn't really serve me anymore. Like I'm trying to predict and be 4 steps ahead, 5 steps ahead, and I can't because life's unpredictable. I'm also no longer in the environment that was so volatile or violent or felt threatening. And so this isn't actually doing anything. In fact, it's just meaning that I have quite shallow relationships with people because they are liking the version of me I'm creating as opposed to who I am. That's what people pleasing is. You end up with all these people who like you or affirm you, but they don't know you. They like the version of you you've curated and created, the version of you that probably lacks authenticity. And there's a lack of depth in that. Every people pleaser that I have worked with has felt deep loneliness. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's because when you people please, you lose yourself. It's a self abandonment for the sake of being chosen by other people. But again, that doesn't really work. Because what you do when you're people pleasing is you're abandoning yourself, and what you're communicating to your brain is these people will also abandon me. Like you kind of got to hear me out because maybe I'm not articulating this well. But if your way of getting relationships, friendships, family, colleagues, peers, friends, whatever, if your method to get relationships is to create a persona that you know they will like, to not be authentic, to not actually show or share your opinions, your thoughts, your feelings. If the way that you build relationships is by becoming something else, what you are communicating to your brain is what I am is not enough. What I am is unlovable. What I am will not be accepted or received. And so you reinforce core beliefs about being insufficient and you end up in relationships of sorts that aren't actually fulfilling. Because what is fulfilling is when someone truly knows you and they stay. Like the reality of friendships and relationships is sometimes you will fall out or you won't be pleased with your friends, or they might say something and you think, whoa, that was a bit problematic, or that you should be cancelled for saying that, but you still stay and you work through it. The quality of a good relationship isn't necessarily not having conflict or disagreements. The quality of a good and healthy relationship is how you build after conflict, how you resolve the conflict. The conflict resolution is what I would use as the metric of the health of your relationship. Because if you're being authentic with the people around you, you will have friction because things that are close to each other have friction. They rub up against each other in a non-weird way, if you know what I mean. They rub up against each other. When you're close with people, there is friction because it's natural. When you're close with someone and you are causing yourself to be something different, there won't be friction because you're pretending, you're acting, and the acting has to stop at some point. And so, yeah, if you're trying to build relationships and the method you use is people pleasing, it's probably why you feel lonely. And the key to people pleasing, or the anecdote to people pleasing, is actually to stop the people pleasing. What I said earlier about shame, and when you view something as a problem, you want to remove the problem. When you are people pleasing, you view yourself as the problem. That's the thing. That's the reality. When you're people pleasing, you are the problem. And what do we do with problems? We get rid of them. We medicate for our problems. We try and overanalyze our problems and overthink our problems. But what do we do with people? We meet them with compassion and understanding. We were able to offer a bit more perspective with people. Because most things we do have a context. Even if the context isn't conscious to us right now, there's context for why you feel or experiencing what you experience. That doesn't excuse bad behavior. That's not what I'm saying. My goodness, hear me out. But but when you are doing something, there is a context, there is a framework, and that's often what people get from therapy. Is they get the context to their behavior, and then they can choose different behavior. But when you view yourself as a problem rather than a person, you abandon yourself. And self abandonment leads to loneliness. And self abandonment leads to feeling inadequate or even stems from feeling inadequate. It's like a full circle moment. This is where you begin and this is where you end. I don't feel enough, so I change myself to build friendships, and I get those friendships, but I still don't feel enough, and so I change myself, etc., etc. And it just keeps going. But again, the anecdote to that is rather than trying to get rid of yourself and self abandonment, you get rid of the real problem, which is the desire to shift yourself. You address the core belief of not being enough. Like where did that come from? Who told you you weren't enough? Who told you you were inadequate? Who told you you weren't lovable? And who told you that just you being yourself and taking up space was too much? If you sit with this feeling of being too much or too little, the question shouldn't be, what do I do with this right now? The question should be, who told me this? And are they actually a valid source? Are there someone who is trustworthy, who had my best interest at heart? Or are they someone who was trying to police me, trying to control me, or trying to make their own life easier? Not easier because you're the problem, but easier because they perhaps didn't have capacity or the skill set to actually be around you properly. You know, like if there is a parent in your life who, every time you played or made a mess, they were like furious. They were like, "Don't do that. You're the worst child. Other children don't do this." Blah blah blah. Blah. And so they silenced you and they told you to stop doing that. Then the reality is you were not the problem in that, because what do children do? They play, they make a mess, they're figuring things out as they should. Like that is age appropriate behavior. But emotionally immature parents or even narcissistic parents try and control their children because they do not have the capacity or the skill set or the intelligence emotionally or literally to let children be children, to sit with what they might not be able to sit with within themselves. And so they police you. And so if you have this core belief that you are not enough, don't collude with that. Don't try and reinforce it by people pleasing. Go back and ask yourself, who told me this? And do I even believe them? Like, if you do not believe your parents' opinions on what you should wear or what you should study or who you should be friends with, why do you believe their opinion about your identity and who you are? Like, let's be real. And this is no disrespect to people's parents, because sometimes when I make content about parents, which is the bulk of my content, people will say, why are you always coming for parents? Why are you always coming for people's families? It's not that I'm trying to attack people's family, but the reality is we all grew up in a family system and we all assumed our family system was normal. Like we all assume our family system's normal until we grow up and we start hearing how other families function. We realize, oh, actually, maybe it was slightly inappropriate for my parent to always be keeping me in the house and not letting me go out and play with my friends. Maybe it was strange that I wasn't allowed to actually choose what I wanted to study and I had to do a handful of jobs, otherwise I'd be classed as a failure. Like maybe it was wrong that I wasn't actually allowed to say my opinion or have my own boundaries, like that my body was fully in their control. And where I have compassion and where I have perspective, because I think sometimes people think I'm always siding with the child, and more often than not, I am. I understand the role of a parent is to care and nurture, but also guide their children. And so, yes, there are moments where parents have to tell their child, no, you're not doing that. Like, there's no way you're not touching the hot stove. You're not playing with that person who we know that it won't be a beneficial relationship. We know that child does things that we do not want you involved with. I totally understand the parents try and protect, but emotionally immature parents don't just try and protect, they try and stop you from actually just being a child. They adultify you. This keeps happening to people. And I don't think people are ever given space to acknowledge it because we're told we have to honor our parents. I think you can honor someone while also acknowledging the truth. I think those things can be possible. And so that's why I'm always mentioning parents and family relations, because so much of what we're dealing with now was set into motion by them or in those environments. Um, One of the most interesting sort of reflections I heard this year was a therapist I follow on TikTok who was talking about trauma. And he was asked, what is trauma like? And what's the point in therapy? Are people just wallowing in their shit? Like, are people just wallowing in their problems and being victims? Like, why would anyone want to be a victim? And he said, the thing is therapy isn't even necessarily what happened, it's the effects of what happened. And at times, therapy is, well, no, not therapy. I've misspoken. But he was explaining what's the point of therapy, because people always say it's creating victims, like this generation of snowflakes. Everyone's super emotional and entitled. Like those are some critiques I hear about this generation. To be fair, some of those critiques I can see why people say them, even if I don't agree. Like I think resilience is something we should work with. But anyway, he was asked this question about therapy and trauma, and he was asked, "What's the point? Like, what happened happened. Leave it in the past." But the reality is so many of us feel stuck now because we have not healed what happened in the past. Like trauma is not even always the event; it's the effects of the event. There are things that you are dealing with right now that were set in motion ages ago. And if you do not ever go back there and process those things and address those things, then you will continue to feel stuck. It's like the people pleasing example I gave. If you never address the core belief of feeling inadequate, you will never overcome people pleasing and you will continue to feel stuck. And that stuckness will lead you to having shallow relationships or no relationships. The amount of people pleasers I know who feel like they have no friends and no partners, they don't put themselves out there because they don't feel good enough. All these things come from this core belief. And you have to address that in order to move forward. You have to go back in order to go forward. And it feels like a contradiction, but the reality is it's true. And even if it's been decades, sometimes the reason you feel stuck right now is because of something that happened years ago. I always find it really interesting, and this perhaps is part of my story. I always find it really interesting when I encounter people who are religious, who struggle with therapy. And I hear this critique a lot from religious people, like just trust God, like God's got this. Why would you be struggling if God's in your life? I mean, firstly, that's a bit of a dismissive perspective. There are so many people across the globe, like, don't just think of your country, because I think sometimes, depending on our religion, we just think of our own congregation, our own space, our own context. But if you think about things wider, there are people who are struggling not because of a fault of their own, but simply because life has happened or something has happened, or the powers that be, the systems that exist in our world have created destruction. And unfortunately, they've ended up being collateral for power battles, and power struggles. And so to say, well, God's got it, like, don't worry. Again, very dismissive. But secondly, what I'm aware of, if we look at human anthropology, I think is the word. If we look at anthropology, I think most faiths and religion will acknowledge a sort of spiritual self, a physical self, and like a mental self, of a physical self, like body, soul, and spirit. Let's go with that. And I think if we are sitting with the different parts of who we are as people, that includes our emotions. And I think we have to know how to address our emotions. Uh, if it just worked to give something to God, I don't think we would see as much trauma come out of religious spaces. And I think that's something we need to contend with. I have total empathy for religious people who ask me, what's the point in therapy when God's got you? But the reality is in the same way, when you need medical attention, yes, you pray, but you also seek some sort of medical attention. The same for our mental health. Sometimes you're really struggling and you are praying diligently. There are people I've worked with who are seriously committed to their faith, seriously committed to their belief and dedicated to God, and yet they struggle. And so it is not because they have failed or aren't committed to God that they are struggling. It's because they just need attention. Our mind and the effects of things happening in our mind can be huge. It can have an impact that, because it's not seen all the time, is completely dismissed, but can be just as pressing and important to address as a physical ailment. If someone had broken their leg in front of you, you would not tell them to simply trust God and keep going. You would ask them to attend to their leg and to trust God and keep going. Does that make sense? You would put a cast over it. You would ask them to have things checked out. They would go to their checkups. They would maybe have to do physio as a way of rehabilitating and recovering and building muscle again. And that's kind of what therapy does. It's that process of rehabilitation. It's that process of healing. Because sometimes healing is instant and that's so beautiful and miraculous. But more often than not, it's not. Like, more often than not, it's a process. And the process, I would say, is actually something quite sacred, and something that we shouldn't take lightly. But I see it often be dismissed in the context of religious space. I see it often be dismissed. And I see the conversation around emotions and having emotional intelligence uh, be belittled. Or at times, even it can be a bit of a gendered conversation, right? Like I can sometimes see men think that their emotions are not worthy of taking up space. I think stoicism can be beautiful. Like, I have to say that. I do think it can be beautiful, but in its extremes, I think it's just suppression of your emotions. I don't think your ability to suppress your emotions proves that you are mature or manly or strong. I think it just means you're able to suppress your emotions. In the same way, I think those people who are constantly emotional and dysregulated, I don't think that's a good thing. Like, I'm not saying that you always need to be crashing out. Sometimes learn to regulate your emotions. Like, is it a crash out or are you just dysregulated and you don't know how to communicate what you need? That's what we need to process. That's what we need to think about. Um, yeah, I think when we talk about therapy and our emotions and our mental health, it's really important to have a balanced perspective. It's important to be able to process and address what happened in your life for the sake of your well-being. Um, Here's the thing. One of the things I've been thinking recently, kind of on this topic of what is trauma, how do we process things, how do we experience therapy when therapy is really inaccessible. One of the things that I am constantly trying to do in my practice is make it as accessible to people. Obviously, there is a massive cost to therapy, and so trying to make that accessible is difficult because things have to be paid for, membership has to be paid for. When it's in person, rooms have to be booked, but therapy is something that I wish more people had access to. Not because I think it always works. I always say to my clients, sometimes you'll meet a therapist and you'll think, "Ugh, I can't work with them." And you need to trust that feeling. Because the best type of therapy, I read a study years ago. I forget who even did the study, but I promise it exists. I read a study years ago, and they said the best type of therapy isn't a specific modality of therapy. So it's not the CBTs, IFS, none of that EMDR. It's actually your relationship with the person you're working with. It's about the relationship you have with the person you're working with. That's how you know that therapy is going to be successful. If you feel like you have met someone, you feel like you actually connect with them, you feel like they have the ability to empathize and understand you, you feel like you would be able to build a good relationship with them. That's when you've struck gold. And that's when I would encourage you to stay with that sort of therapist. Or if you're with the therapist and you think, this isn't working out. Like, they don't seem to understand me. I feel slightly dismissed. I feel like we're not getting anywhere. I mean, firstly, I would say to people, bring it into the session. The best type of therapy, maybe this is an unpopular opinion. I would say it's a really good opinion because it's mine. But the best type of therapy is when you're actually honest with your therapist. My favorite sessions is when someone comes in and they say, I'm really mad at you. I'll say, oh gosh, I didn't even know you were mad. Like, what's going on? They'll say, last week you might have said something, it really annoyed me. And what do we do? I don't get defensive in that moment. We address it because we're adults and we can address things. For a lot of us, we've not experienced healthy conflict. Our association with conflict is violence and destruction and being given the cold shoulder. Our association with conflict is rejection and being ghosted, not being heard or being shouted over or being belittled completely, infantilized. Maybe it's being told you have to fight if you're in conflict because words aren't enough. Maybe it's the crashing out I mentioned earlier, which is just our inability to regulate our emotions and communicate our needs. A lot of us, that's our experience. But as you grow into adulthood, what you will realize is conflict isn't the problem. Not being able to do conflict well is the problem. One of the things that really transformed my brain, and this is going to sound ridiculous, so you need to hear me out because genuinely, I don't think you know what I'm about to say. So just humor me for a second. So obviously, like I said, a bit about me. Grew up really shy. Grew up in a very religious home. And that comes with its commandments and its desired ways of living. And so growing up in that sort of environment meant that I stayed away from conflict. I genuinely cannot remember arguing with any friend throughout the duration of my education. No primary school, not in high school, like no like shouting match. like shouting battle of sorts. And so I just did not do conflict. I didn't see it at home. My parents didn't really argue, which I don't just think was because of religious reasons. I also think it's because they generally just didn't argue in front of us. I'm sure they had conflicts, or I know they had conflicts. But in front of us children, I never once saw them argue. Of course, with my siblings, there'd be bickering, but bickering is the word I'd use because it never really got to the point of an argument. Um, I would back down, they would back down. It would be like, "Why did you take the last cookie?" "'Cause I did." Done. My parents would intercept at that point, and so there was not really this back and forth. I'm not used to that. I didn't grow up around that. And so years ago, like absolutely years ago, I was at a friend's house and they put on Love Island. And I was like, what the heck is this? Like trash TV. Now I absolutely love reality TV. It's like my form of respite because I work with such serious problems. Like people will bring very serious things into therapy. I love watching something that is basically nonsense because my brain's always on alert at work, so I need it to switch off. And that's what reality TV does for me, and I love that, and I won't apologize for that. But anyway, I was at a friend's, we were watching Love Island. I was thinking, what is this nonsense? Like, I don't understand why people would watch this. But I watched one episode, and then the next day I went over and we watched another episode because, when Love Island's on, you watch it every day. And I got into it slightly, not really, but like, I could tolerate it, I could watch it. One of the revelations I had while watching Love Island, like Love Island was healing for me, and don't clown me for this, but it was, because there was a point, I think it was season 6, so it was like Amber, Ovi season, it was Anna's season where she was shouting at Jordan. I think there was that Scottish guy, Anton. It was that, like, and so it's that season. So many big personalities. I think this was Molly May's season as well. Um, and throughout that season, don't know if anyone else noticed just how much conflict was happening. Like people shouting at each other, people absolutely losing it at each other. And do you know what healed me about watching that season? It wasn't necessarily the crash outs because that made me deeply uncomfortable. Like I went straight into fight or flight. But what healed me is the fact that someone could crash out, be screaming in someone's face, and the next day they resolved the conflict. Like things just went back to normal. And of course, that doesn't mean they had long term friendships or relationships. But watching conflict resolution on Love Island taught me that conflict resolution is possible. And this sounds so ridiculous. I know it, like I genuinely know it does. But being raised in a way where I didn't actually see conflict. So my only association with conflict was destruction and it being permanent. Like you could never go back if you'd said something, and it being something that completely will end things. Like I associated conflicts with endings. And I didn't want endings. And so I didn't allow myself to enter into conflicts. But watching it on Love Island, realizing, oh my gosh, they got back together, even though last night she was telling him that he was insert expletive here. Like, I can't remember. I wish I could quote that season of Love Island, but I actually can't remember it. I just remember Maura being like, "Woo, woo, 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 woo," to that guy who had like made the comment about whether she was going to sleep with him. Uh, but but watching that changed my brain chemistry. Like genuinely, after I thought maybe conflict isn't that bad. Like maybe I need to lean into being argumentative. Of course, I'm being a bit dramatic there. Of course, I didn't watch Love Island and just start arguing with everyone. But what I did do is I started giving myself permission, if I did have a disagreement with someone, to say it to their face, like to actually bring it to them. Not in the same way some of those girls did on Love Island, because I love them, but was it handled maturely? No, but they were young, so that's why it wasn't handled maturely. Like that's the context, and so I totally understand it. But giving yourself permission to say your opinion, even if you know the other person might not agree, I think is one of the best things you can do because it honors yourself. And the right friendships or relationships will be able to sit with your differences and it not necessarily cause a divide or an ending. It might not cause unity, but I think conflict resolution can cause deeper relationships. I only will bring up things that have hurt me that a friend has done if I care about the relationship. I only will put a boundary in place if I care about preserving the relationship. A boundary and an ultimatum are different. A boundary is something you put in place to protect yourself and your energy and the space or access someone has to you in order to maintain a relationship of sorts. So if I had a friend and they were constantly calling me, like every day they were calling me, and it was not working for me, I would put a boundary in place and I would say, hey, like, actually, I can't call every day, but I'd love to speak to you every Saturday. Let's give that as a silly example. If they then were able to meet my boundary, and I stopped giving them access, because the boundary is twofold. It's not just about you giving someone an instruction, it's also me not picking up the phone if they're calling every day because I've set that boundary. And so I need to control my actions. If that's able to happen, that will build strength in the relationship. Why? Because I won't be building this hidden resentment for this friend. I won't be feeling aggravated by this person who's trying to contact me all the time. And they won't be feeling disappointed by me because I'm not able to meet their expectations or standards. Now, an ultimatum is something you would put in place as a last resort. I don't know if you've ever watched the show, The Ultimatum, but it's something you put in place to say, if you do not do this, then I'm leaving. Like, if you do not do this, then it's over. That's not what a boundary is. An ultimatum's like a final request, like a final plea. And the results or the consequence of an ultimatum is that things end. It is that relationships will be severed if the person doesn't do the thing. A boundary, it requires accountability on your part. It requires you to stop giving access to people. It requires you to also maintain your own sort of framework and your own boundary in order for others to be in healthy relationship with you. And so boundaries are super, super important. And true friendships leave space for the boundaries, and they leave space for the gritty conversations, because tough conversations produce growth. Tough conversations with friendships produce growth in those friendships. Tough conversations in relationships produce growth in those relationships. When you stay silent, you are suffering. When you stay silent, you are putting yourself in a difficult situation. And the reality is, and maybe this is tough love, but it's from a therapist, so I hope you hear my heart. When you stay silent on something that you do not like if you're in a friendship and the person's always critiquing you, like you don't like it, they're always making a snide comment about your appearance. When you stay silent in that and you keep putting yourself in that environment with that friend, you end up being complicit in what's happening. That is not me victim blaming, so hear me out, because I know that would be comment number one. I'm not victim blaming, but what I am saying is there comes a point where you cannot complain for the environments you are putting yourself in. Again, the environments you're putting yourself in. That is not if you live at home and your parents are neglectful. That's not an environment you've put yourself in. Even with a job, for some of us, we can't necessarily leave our jobs yet. But if you are doing nothing to get out of a friendship or a relationship where you both live separately, where someone is constantly doing something that is niggling at you, then you end up being complicit. And that can be really damaging. And again, this comes back to this self abandonment thing that I keep touching on. Your self abandonment is ruining your life. Like, that's the reality of it. The more that you deny your emotions, your opinions, your perspectives, the more that you change yourself for other people, what you do is you don't actually live your life. You become a bit of an actress or an actor. You become a spectator of your own life. Most people I know who are people pleasers and who are on autopilot in their own life have a lot of opinions and spend a lot of their spare time critiquing and analyzing what they did. Do you know why they critique and analyze? Because they were performing. You critique and analyze performances. You don't critique and analyze people. Or at least if you're a good person and emotionally mature, you don't critique and analyze people. You critique and analyze performances. And so once you start realizing that this is all about the self-abandonment that I'm doing, this is all about the inadequacy that I'm feeling, then you will be able to actually grow and live your life. And then you'll be able to actually heal some of those core wounds that you've experienced when you were younger. So that's what you have to do. And if you want reciprocity, what a tongue twister. If you want reciprocity, you need to start showing up authentic. Because what happens when two people are people pleasing each other? Have you ever had a friend who does not know how to make a decision? This is one of my pet peeves. I know it sounds ridiculous, and I know some of my friends think I am the type of person who doesn't know how to make decisions, but it's not true. The reality is, when I'm around someone who doesn't know how to make a decision, I act like I don't know how to make a decision to almost force them into making a decision for us. I don't know if it's good or bad, but maybe it's my toxic trait, and I'm okay with that. But when you're around people who don't know how to make a decision, are always trying to please you, it puts you into this weird power dynamic where at times it might feel like you're a parent. Like, It is quite obvious when someone just wants approval from you. It's quite obvious when someone is seeking your validation and attention. And to be honest, it feels a bit unfair when you're put into this dynamic where you don't actually want to be their parent. I don't want to be your parent. I want to be your friend. And so stop acting like a child who needs me to constantly affirm them and validate them. I said this in a video the other day, but the reason you feel dissatisfied in your relationships is because the expectations you have on your relationships are not ones you have on peers or partners. They are expectations you would have for a parent or guardian. If you want someone to always have access to you, or for you to always be able to call on them and have access to them, for them to always affirm you, for them to take care of you when you are sick, for them to show up for you, for them to cheer you on, you are wanting a parent. If you need them to always make decisions for you, you want a parent. Yes, in healthy relationships, you might meet people who care for you and can affirm you, but the constant part of this desire, and that's the key word here, is constant access, constant affirmation, constant care. That continuity you're looking for, that constance, if that's the word, that comes from the fact that your desire is probably an unmet childhood need. It's probably a wounded inner child that wants that affirmation. But you are setting your friends and your loved ones up for failure if you expect them to parent you, because that's not what they're signing up for. And so they are coming into a relationship, and it's almost as if you've made them sign a contract they are unaware of. They don't know the terms and conditions. They don't know why you're suddenly mad at them because they didn't show up for you and come to your house every day. They didn't sign up for that. And so allow yourself to start saying what you need, but also, part of self-love, or part of healing from the self-abandonment that we can be in routine of when we are people pleasing, when we are constantly defaulting to being someone else. Part of the healing process is learning how to give ourselves what we need. Our parents might not have met all our needs. In fact, all parents have failed somehow because they're human, and that's natural. But we can give ourselves some of the things we feel are lacking. Maybe the validation you need doesn't come from another person. Maybe it comes from yourself. Or maybe the attention that you want is attention you can give yourself. Because how does it make sense that you always want others to give you attention, but you don't do it for yourself? Like, how does it make sense? Or how would it make sense if you want others to care for you, but you can't even take care of yourself? Start giving yourself some of these things, and you will start seeing yourself heal and grow. Yeah. Anyway, guys, that's it for me. Thank you for coming to my first little episode. I've been yapping for ages. My throat is dry and parched. But I thought I'd give some more insight. Like I said at the beginning, this is a bit about my reflections outside of sessions. Next week, I'm probably going to answer some questions or scenarios, which is something I was umming and ahhing about. But again, we're here now, so let's do it. So if you have any, feel free to leave them in the comments or DM me on any of my platforms. Uh, but for now, thank you for coming to Therapy with B. I'll see you next week. Bye.